Welcome back. Now we'll move on to the portion of today's lesson where we will talk about stakeholder analysis. All right, when you first hear the phrase stakeholder analysis, that might bring a few different images to mind, right? You might have this image up top. We have Buffy the Vampire Slayer. There she is holding her stake, ready to slay a vampire. If anyone's seen that show from the late 90s, early 2000s. That's not really what we're talking about with stakeholder analysis. Maybe we're thinking in terms of, if you go to Fogo de Chao or another Brazilian steakhouse, you have all the servers coming around. You can see them there all just holding stakes. Also not what we're talking about when we're talking about stakeholders and stakeholder analysis. In fact, what we're talking about is, as you can see our definition here of a stakeholder, someone, either a person, an individual, or an organization or agency that has a vested interest in the problem and its solution. All right, so that's the definition we'll use for a stakeholder for SE301 and really throughout your time in the systems department. And so then that begs the question, what is stakeholder analysis? So that is what we're trying to do in stakeholder analysis is enable us as systems engineers to identify the key objectives, functions, and constraints of a system or decision problem, and essentially how that will impact the decision makers and all of our stakeholders, right? How are our stakeholders tied to the system that is under consideration? We'll now look at several different classifications of stakeholders and where they might fall into when we're talking about different titles and different types. All right, first up, we have the decision authority. This type of stakeholder has ultimate decision power, right? They can approve and implement a system, or they can deny, not fund a system, and essentially it will cease to exist. All right, so here a quick picture of a decision authority figure. Harry Truman, right, the president, known for making that very impactful decision, or two decisions, to use atomic weapons at the end of World War II. And you can see on his desk, he has his slogan, "The buck stops here," right? So the buck stops with him, and he is a great example of what a decision authority would be. Next up is a client. So as you all at some point, either in SC450 or in your systems capstone, year-long capstone, you'll work with a client. The client is the person or organization that actually asks for work to be done, right? So they will solicit our help as systems engineers for that project, and typically they will also provide some level of funding to make sure that the work is able to be completed, right? That funding can pay for things like software, things like travel, things like additional support that might be needed, etc. That's all coming from the client, and the client is normally the one that defines system requirements, how well the system needs to perform. All right, and beneath here we have an old Calvin and Hobbes comic strip. You can pause it if you want to read the whole thing, but really the point to highlight is on the far left, where he says he can't choose his clients, right? And that's important. So oftentimes as systems engineers, we don't get to choose who we work for. We are solicited and eventually funded by our client, and at the end of the day we have to make the client happy, right? So that is a consideration we need to keep in mind as we're going through stakeholder analysis and throughout the SDP, is we don't get to choose our client, but we do have to satisfy some of the requirements they might lay out for us. All right, next up, our next classification is an owner. So the owner is the person or organization that is responsible for proper and purposeful system operation. So a good way to think about this is, who is the person that actually, not to use the same word, but the person that owns the system that we're considering. So in this example, if we're looking at a coffee shop, this gentleman in front here would be the owner. So we will contrast that in a moment with the user. But so the owner, he is responsible for that coffee shop, but he is not necessarily the one implementing and using all the equipment and the devices within it. Our next classification is the user, right? So that person or organization that is accountable for proper and purposeful system operation. So here we have Jeff Gordon, a retired NASCAR driver. He does not own that car he is driving, but he is accountable for using it properly, right? Proper and purposeful system operation. So he is the user of the car, but he is not the owner of the car. If we were to go back to our coffee example, you know, the barista at Starbucks or your favorite local coffee shop would be the user of the equipment, but not the owner of the equipment. All right, so they are accountable for using it correctly. And if they were to break something because of negligence, or they were having a bad day and they were angry, so a piece of equipment was damaged, that person would be still accountable for it, but they are not the owner of the equipment, they are the user of the equipment. Next up is our consumer classification, right? So consumers are people or organizations that receive benefits, either direct or indirect, from the products or services that the system provides. All right, and you don't necessarily need to pay to be a consumer, right? You think automatically here, a consumer, you think, you know, someone that's going to Walmart or Target as being a consumer, but you don't necessarily, does not have to be a money transfer, right? So a great example is, you can see in our graphic here, the Army soldiers are consumers of the transportation provided by the Air Force, right? So they are receiving direct or indirect benefit. So the soldiers are able to fly and get to Afghanistan and combat far faster by leveraging our partnership with the Air Force than if they had to, you know, drive, take a boat, etc. So that is a direct benefit for the Army, is in this case would be classified as a consumer of transportation provided from the Air Force. All right, and then our last classification is the interconnected group. So interconnected are persons, people, or organizations that are physically or virtually connected and can still have potential benefits, costs, or risks from that connection. All right, so here you can see a famous part of the Berlin Wall was being built. So those folks that lived in East and West Berlin, they did not fall into any of our other categories, right? They were not the owners, the users, the decision makers, decision authorities, or the consumers, but they were still certainly impacted and had an interconnectivity to the Berlin Wall as that system was put in place, right? They definitely felt some additional costs and additional risks to their well-being, their family situation, their connectivity to the outside world. So they had a physical and a virtual connection that was maybe severely impacted. So we could classify them as interconnected stakeholders. All right, so those are our stakeholder types. We'll now look at another way we can classify stakeholders, which is known as the stakeholder saliency model. All right, in our stakeholder saliency model, what we're looking at is we're going to classify stakeholders based on three different characteristics, right? Power, which we show in red, legitimacy shown in green, and urgency shown in yellow. And we can put those three different characteristics together to build this Venn diagram. The Venn diagram is showing, so you can see our definitions below for power, the ability to bring about the outcome they desire, and that can be done either through coercion, utility, or norms. Legitimacy, which is essentially being an expert or having recognized expertise and being acknowledged as being representative and having a correct ability to work in that realm. And then urgency is a time sensitivity and a criticality to make decisions in a timely manner. All right, so when you consider all three of those, you can overlap them, and you see a definitive stakeholder has all three characteristics, while a dangerous stakeholder, he or she might have power, they might have urgency, but if they don't have that legitimacy, if they don't have that knowledge base or expertise, then they're a dangerous stakeholder, because they can, you know, they have the ability to make the decisions, they want to make them quickly, but they don't have legitimacy. They don't have knowledge in that area where we are operating. Conversely, if you have someone that has urgency, they want things done quickly, and they think it's critically important, and they have legitimacy, but they don't have decision-making power, then they would be a dependent stakeholder, right? They're dependent on other folks to get the job done. And if we overlay power and legitimacy, we see someone that is dominant, right? They can make decisions. They have the knowledge to make informed decisions. However, time is not as big a factor to them. So that would be someone that is a dominant player. When we're using stakeholder saliency, the thing to think about is we probably want to focus our efforts on collecting stakeholder information from those that lie in the definitive, definitely, and potentially the dangerous, dependent, or dominant, more so than ones that only exhibit one characteristic. We also have the non-stakeholders that fall outside of the three. All right, so an example, this is some work that I did in grad school. We were looking at the college football playoff as a system, or as an enterprise, as we called it, and we applied the stakeholder saliency model to some of the key organizations that have an impact on the college football playoff. All right, and you can see in our far left column the actual stakeholders we identified and went on to interview some. And then, for example, we had ESPN, the schools, the selection committee, coaches, players. But then we also categorized them based on their level of saliency, right? So we said the selection committee and the key conferences were definitive, right? They exhibited that power, that urgency, and that legitimacy. But then you can go down the list and see down the bottom, players and coaches only fell in the discretionary category. So this is just an example, and you can pause if you want to read a little more analysis on what we were looking at. But essentially, this is a way that saliency can be applied to a real-world system or enterprise. So we've talked a little bit about stakeholder analysis, but now that begs the question, how do we actually do it? All right, so there's three key stakeholder analysis techniques that we will describe and discuss in SE301, and you can find them on the text on page 303. This is where this table is coming from. But essentially we have interviews, focus groups, and surveys. All right, we'll start by talking about interviews. And in interviews, the key here is who you want to target, and the answer to that is key leaders or key representatives. All right. During the interview, you want to spend about 30 to 60 minutes, and you want to typically have a scripted set of questions to go into the senior leaders meeting with. However, I'd recommend you don't send that list of questions ahead of time. Oftentimes what will happen is the decision maker, the key leader that you're going to interview will have a bunch of canned answers for you if you do that. So I'd recommend you do not send the questionnaire ahead of time. You just set the meeting, give them the topic, and then you can go in ready to have a good discussion back and forth. Another good tip is to have a note taker so you're able to really have a conversation and not be typing or writing notes feverishly as you interact with your stakeholder. All right, when we talk about focus groups, this is where we have mid-level representatives, and we can have a few more folks in the room, right? You're able to get a more varied set of perspectives, and you can have a discussion where you're able to capture all their feedback. All right. When you're conducting a focus group, good rule of thumb is you want to have about 6 to 12 individuals participating, and then you should probably have one person facilitating and one person, maybe more if necessary, recording all the comments and the interactions that are going on. And then finally, our surveys. So the nice thing about surveys is they are the quickest to run from the participant's perspective, right? You can see it can take as short as, rough range, but you've all participated in surveys, anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes. And you're able to tap into typically the junior to mid-level population, right? You don't want to send a bunch of surveys to, the superintendent, to General Williams, or to General Jeb or the Commandant or anything like that. You typically want to use surveys to collect a lot of data from a lot of lower level folks, and that can really paint the picture of what, potentially if we're talking about the West Point, if we're talking about the Corps of Cadets, what does the Corps think about, a new uniform policy, for example? That might be, we could gather data for that from by running a survey, or maybe we do a combination of survey and focus group, and that would be how we could run it. An important thing to think about when you're running a survey is making sure you take the time to do it well, run it correctly. A fault folks will often run into is they will build out a survey, they will send it, they will hit submit, and then if there's any kind of technical issue, you will lose, your response rate will drop significantly if you ask people to take it 2 and 3 times. So you want to make sure you build it and you test it out with a partner, with a friend, etc., before you go and send that survey. So those interview, focus group, and surveys are key ways of gathering stakeholder analysis. Once we gather that information, we are going to build what we call the findings, conclusions, and recommendations matrix. All right, so the idea here is on our left-hand side, and we'll work left to right, we simply in our findings column, all we do is annotate what we got out of our stakeholder analysis, out of our interviews, focus groups, or surveys. So for example, when we're talking about our findings are facts that are uncovered during our stakeholder analysis, right? So things that we found based on what our stakeholders told us, right? And we should always be able to make it traceable, so that somebody else can say, oh, where did you get that piece of data? Where did you get that opinion or that viewpoint? And we should be able to point to our source. So our findings are essentially all of those facts that we gained by talking to stakeholders and conducting that analysis. Our conclusions, this is where you have to put on your thinking hat and make some inferences from the findings that we have. All right, so you interpret the data, you do some analysis, you make some connections, and from there you can draw some conclusions. And as we talked about with the car buying example, you should kind of put together and combine some findings to build out your conclusions if possible. You're often going to see trends or connections, so you'll go ahead and do that in your conclusions portion of your FCR matrix. And finally, recommendations, which are your courses of action that you want to have going forward. Okay, so sometimes you'll have several conclusions build into a recommendation, and that will eventually drive future work. All right, so your recommendations can help inform as we go into the additional tasks and phases of the SDP. You should be able to look back to your FCR matrix and say, oh, hey, maybe we did need to consider this aspect, or we should have done additional research in this area. All right, that would be something that you'd tie back to your FCR matrix. All right, in the example of our car buying, we said, oh, our recommendation is that our car has good fuel efficiency, it can carry a lot of folks, and safety is paramount, right? That was a recommendation that our car needs to have those different attributes based on our stakeholder analysis. So if you've been hopefully reading along in our green book, in our textbook, they talk about a lot about the rocket problem and designing a rocket. So in our findings, let's say we had interviewed 20 different interviewees and 15 said that we needed to have a smaller mobile rocket system. And the military has proposals to build rockets that can be easily maneuvered around the battlefield. So those would be 2 findings. Another finding would be that the range of the rocket needs to be greater than 10 kilometers. And that most interviewees said that the market exists for rockets that can deploy an object between 5 and 10 kilometers. All right, so we have our 4 findings. We can then build that out into 2 conclusions. All right, so in conclusion 1, we say that, hey, mobility is key to a rocket design. And conclusion 2 would be that rockets need to operate only at short ranges. So maybe that's a limitation that we found by doing our research and stakeholder analysis. From there, we go into our recommendations and we say, we recommend going forward that we consider mobile rocket systems that operate only at short ranges, right? Those might be two key decision criteria that we consider going forward. Great. So now that we have talked about our stakeholder analysis, our different techniques for doing it, how we can eventually build that findings, conclusions, recommendations matrix to sum up all of our findings, want to talk about some ethical considerations. All right, so when we're doing all this work with human subjects and interviews, focus groups, and surveys, that is working with human subjects. And in academic settings, such as at West Point or other institutions you may find yourself at, there is this thing called the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. Essentially, there is a governing body that makes sure when you're working with human test subjects that you are doing it properly and responsibly, and you'll have to build out a full report with protocols, and there is a lot of work involved. However, this is really for the good of the subjects, right? We don't want to involve any humans in an experiment or study that could potentially harm them. So that phrase IRB, you may hear that going forward, and that's essentially what the IRB is. It's looking at the benefits of research versus the cost or the harm that could be incurred. As you can see at the bottom there, for our setting, it's something we should always be considering, right? So when I was in grad school, I had to do a full IRB when I was conducting a study that involved interviewing a whole bunch of folks that are involved in the air traffic control world. And I had to put that in about 6 months prior to actually doing any of those interviews and having those discussions. So it is something that needs to be considered, but not something to be scared of, something that we should appreciate because it's giving us a little bit of direction and making sure nobody is taking advantage or doing harm to our subjects. All right, so that being said, that concludes today's lesson on the intro to problem definition and stakeholder analysis. We'll have some interesting case studies and board problems to talk through, and look forward to being with you tomorrow when we talk about functional and requirements analysis.